August 19th, 1942, 6 in the morning, somewhere in the California desert. The sound is the rumble of tank engines, hundreds of them, echoing across the flat expanse of sand and scrub. Major General George S. Patton, Jr. stands on the turret of his command tank, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching columns of M3 Grant tanks maneuver through the morning heat. He is observing Desert Training Center exercises, preparing American armored forces for combat in North Africa. His uniform is immaculate despite the dust. His ivory-handled revolvers gleam at his waist, and his face, weathered and hard, shows the intense focus of a man who lives for war and has not yet had his chance to fight in this one. An aide climbs up to the turret, saluting sharply. "General, sir, priority message from Washington." Patton does not lower his binoculars. "It can wait. I'm watching how 2nd Battalion handles that ridgeline, and they're making a goddamn mess of it." The aide hesitates. "Sir, it's about the Canadian operation at Dieppe. The raid has begun." Now, Patton lowers his binoculars. He turns to the aide, and there's something in his eyes, a hunger, an intensity that makes the younger man take a step back. "When?" Patton demands. "Approximately 2 hours ago, sir. Initial reports are coming through now." Patton drops from the turret with surprising agility for a 56-year-old man. "Get me to headquarters, now, and get me every scrap of intelligence they're sending through. I want to know everything, every goddamn thing." Because Patton knows what this means. The Canadians are hitting Fortress Europe. They are testing the German defenses. They are conducting the kind of bold, aggressive operation that Patton himself dreams of leading. And whatever happens at Dieppe, whether success or failure, will shape how America fights this war. As Patton's jeep races across the desert toward headquarters, he does not know that the Canadians are already dying on the beaches of Dieppe. He does not know that the operation is going catastrophically wrong, that tanks are stuck on the shingle, that men are being cut down by machine gun fire, that the raid will become one of the worst disasters in Canadian military history. What Patton learns when he arrives at headquarters changes his understanding of amphibious warfare. And what he says to his staff in response to that intelligence will influence American military doctrine, will shape the planning for future operations, and will reveal both the brilliance and the brutality of one of America's most controversial generals. But to understand what Patton said, you must first understand what he thought was happening at Dieppe, because the story that reached American headquarters on the morning of August 19th was not complete. It was not accurate. And for a brief, shining moment, Patton believed something that would have profound implications for how he viewed the Canadians, the British, and the future of the war. This is not just the story of a military operation. It is the story of how intelligence failures, communication breakdowns, and the fog of war can create false narratives that shape decisions at the highest levels. And it is the story of what one general learned from a battle he never fought in a place he never visited that would help him win victories thousands of miles away. To understand Patton's reaction to Dieppe, you must first understand Patton himself. George Smith. Patton, Jr. is a man of contradictions. He is a California aristocrat who dresses like a cowboy. He is a deeply educated man who cultivates an image of brutal simplicity. He is a military theorist who writes poetry. He is a devout Christian who swears like a demon. And he is, above all else, a man who believes in aggressive action. Patton's military philosophy is straightforward. Attack or always attack. Speed and violence overwhelm the enemy. Hesitation kills. Defense is weakness. And the only unforgivable sin in war is to do nothing. This philosophy is shaped by his experiences in World War I when he commanded tanks in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He has seen what happens when armies become static, when they dig in and wait. Stalemate, slaughter, years of grinding attrition. Patton is determined that American forces under his command will never fight that way. They will be mobile. They will be fast. They will hit the enemy before the enemy knows they are coming. But in August 1942, Patton has not yet commanded troops in combat in this war. He is training armored divisions in the California desert, preparing them for deployment to North Africa. He is champing at the bit, desperate for action, watching younger generals get their chances while he trains soldiers for battles he will not fight. So when news arrives that the Canadians are raiding Dieppe, Patton's interest is immediate and intense. This is the kind of operation he dreams about, a direct assault on German-held territory, tanks hitting the beach, infantry storming fortified positions, exactly the kind of aggressive action that Patton believes wins wars. Patton arrives at his headquarters building and strides to the operations room. His staff is already gathered around the map table where a large map of the English Channel coast is spread out. Pins mark the location of Dieppe. Radio transcripts and decoded messages are being delivered in a steady stream. Patton's intelligence officer, a careful, methodical colonel named Harrison, begins briefing him. Sir, at approximately 0450 hours local time, Canadian forces began landing at Dieppe and 4 adjacent beaches. The force consists of approximately 5,000 troops, primarily from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by Churchill tanks and Royal Navy destroyers. Patton interrupts. What's their objective? Harrison consults his notes. The stated objectives are to seize and hold the port for several hours, destroy port facilities, capture prisoners for intelligence purposes, and test German coastal defenses. Patton nods slowly. Ambitious. Go on. Harrison continues. Initial reports from British sources indicate heavy fighting. German resistance is described as strong. Communications are difficult due to combat conditions. Patton leans over the map, studying the layout of Dieppe. The town is in a natural amphitheater, surrounded by cliffs. The beach is narrow, backed by a seawall. The Germans have had 2 years to fortify it. To Patton's trained eye, it looks like a death trap. Who's commanding? Patton asks. Harrison checks another sheet. Major General John Hamilton Roberts, commanding 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. Overall command is British, under Combined Operations Headquarters. Patton grunts. He has opinions about British command structures, most of them unfavorable. He believes the British are too cautious, too methodical, too wedded to careful planning at the expense of aggressive action. But he says nothing yet. He is waiting for the operational reports. Over the next 90 minutes, as the sun climbs higher over the California desert and the temperature soars toward 100 degrees, Patton and his staff monitor incoming reports from Dieppe. And here is where the story takes its crucial turn. Because the early intelligence reaching American headquarters is fragmentary, delayed, and fundamentally misleading. The first substantial report arrives at approximately 0730 California time, which is 3:30 in the afternoon at Dieppe. The report, transmitted via British channels and decoded by American signals intelligence, states that Canadian forces have penetrated German defenses and are engaging enemy forces in the town of Dieppe. This is technically true. Some Canadian soldiers, specifically men from the Essex Scottish Regiment and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, have indeed penetrated into the town. But what the report does not say is that these men are isolated, unsupported, and being systematically destroyed. The report does not say that the main body of Canadian forces is pinned on the beach, unable to advance and unable to retreat. It does not say that the tanks are immobilized, stuck on the shingle, or destroyed by German guns. What the report says, in the dry language of military intelligence, is that Canadian forces have achieved penetration of enemy defenses. And Patton, reading this report, believes he is witnessing a successful assault. He says to his assembled staff, his voice hard with satisfaction, "The Canadians have broken through. They're in the town. That's how you do it. Hit hard, hit fast, get off the beach before the enemy can react." His staff, who have been trained by Patton and share his aggressive philosophy, nod in agreement. This is exactly what they have been practicing in the desert: rapid movement, overwhelming firepower, speed over caution. A second report arrives at 0800. This one contains a time reference that will prove crucial to the story. It states that Canadian forces achieved penetration of coastal defenses at approximately 0520 hours Dieppe time. Patton's intelligence officer does the math. Sir, if they landed at 0450 and penetrated by 0520, that's 30 minutes from landing to breakthrough. 30 minutes. Patton stares at the map, 30 minutes from hitting a fortified beach to breaking through into the town. It is an extraordinary achievement, the kind of aggressive, successful assault that Patton has been preaching about for months. If true, it validates everything he believes about warfare. He turns to his staff, and what he says next will be repeated, in various forms, in staff colleges and military histories for decades to come. Gentlemen, pay attention to what you're seeing here. The Canadians have just demonstrated how to conduct an amphibious assault, 30 minutes from beach to breakthrough. Do you understand what that means? His staff waits. They know Patton is about to deliver a lesson. It means aggression works, Patton continues, his voice rising with intensity. It means you don't sit on a beach and get shot to pieces. You move. You attack. You give the enemy no time to react. 30 goddamn minutes. He points at the map. The British have been telling us that amphibious assaults require careful preparation, methodical advance, naval bombardment for hours before landing. Bullshit. The Canadians just proved it. Hit hard, hit fast, accept casualties, and break through before the enemy knows what hit them. Patton paces the operations room, his boots clicking sharply on the concrete floor. His staff watches him, mesmerized. When Patton is in this mode, when he is teaching and preaching his philosophy of war, he is magnetic. "I want every officer in this command to understand what happened at Dieppe," Patton says. "The Canadians did what we're going to do in North Africa. They didn't hesitate. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They attacked, and they succeeded." He pauses, and his face hardens even more. "And if the Canadians can do it, American soldiers damn well better be able to do it. We're not going to be shown up by a Dominion army." This last comment reveals something important about Patton's worldview. He respects the Canadians as fighters, but he also sees them as competition. America is a latecomer to the war. The British have been fighting since 1939. The Canadians have been training and preparing for years. Patton is acutely aware that American forces are untested. He is determined that when American soldiers enter combat, they will perform at least as well as their allies, better if possible. The Dieppe raid, as Patton understands it at this moment, is a benchmark. The Canadians broke through in 30 minutes. American forces must be prepared to do the same or better. He spends the next hour lecturing his staff on the lessons of Dieppe. Speed is essential. Naval gunfire support is helpful, but not decisive. Armor must get off the beach immediately. Infantry must not go to ground on the beach, but must push inland regardless of casualties. Every element of his philosophy is reinforced by what he believes happened at Dieppe. But then, at approximately 09:30 California time, a new series of reports begins arriving, and the story changes completely. The new reports are more detailed and more accurate. They paint a very different picture. Canadian forces are not advancing through Dieppe. They are trapped on the beaches. The tanks are immobilized. Casualties are catastrophic. The Royal Navy is preparing to evacuate survivors. The raid is a disaster. Patton reads these reports in silence. His staff watches him nervously. They know their general's temper. They know how he reacts to bad news. But Patton does not explode. He does not rage. He simply reads each report carefully, his face unreadable. Finally, he looks up. "They're pulling out," he says flatly. "It failed." Harrison, the intelligence officer, clears his throat. "Sir, it appears the initial reports were overly optimistic. Canadian forces did penetrate into the town, but only in small numbers. The majority of the force remained pinned on the beaches." "The withdrawal is underway now." Patton sets down the reports. "How many got into the town?" Harrison checks his notes. "Unclear, sir. Estimates suggest perhaps 200 to 300 men from 2 regiments. Most were killed or captured." Patton's jaw tightens. "And the penetration time, the 30 minutes? Harrison looks uncomfortable. "Sir, that appears to have been based on preliminary reports. Some Canadian elements may have reached the outskirts of the town in approximately 30 minutes, but they did not achieve a breakthrough. They were isolated and eventually overrun or forced to withdraw." Patton stands very still. His staff knows this stillness. It is more dangerous than his shouting. When Patton is quiet, he is thinking. And when Patton thinks, things change. "Get me complete casualty figures as soon as they're available," Patton says quietly. "Get me a full after-action report when the British compile it, and get me the German side of this as soon as intelligence can extract it from signals traffic." He dismisses his staff except for his chief of staff and his intelligence officer. The 3 men remain in the operations room, staring at the map of Dieppe. Patton speaks first. "I told you they broke through in 30 minutes, he says. "I was wrong." Harrison starts to respond, but Patton cuts him off. "I was wrong because I believed what I wanted to believe. I saw what I expected to see, aggressive action leading to rapid success, but it didn't happen that way." He turns to face the 2 officers. "That's lesson 1 from Dieppe. Don't trust initial reports. Don't build theories on incomplete intelligence. Wait for facts." He pauses. "But I'll tell you something else. Those Canadians who did get into the town, those 200 or 300 men who penetrated the defenses, they did something extraordinary. They broke into a fortified German position under fire. They did it quickly, and they did it against odds that should have stopped them cold." Patton walks to the map and traces the beach at Dieppe with his finger. "So the question is, why did some of them succeed while most of them failed? What was different? What can we learn?" This is Patton at his best. Not the theatrical general who slaps soldiers and makes inflammatory speeches, but the serious student of warfare who analyzes battles to understand what works and what doesn't. Over the next several days, as more complete reports from Dieppe filter through to American headquarters, Patton conducts his own analysis. He compiles information from British sources, from decoded German communications, from interrogations of the few Canadian survivors who make it back to England. And he reaches a series of conclusions that will shape American amphibious doctrine for the rest of the war. On August 22nd, 3 days after the raid, Patton calls a meeting of all senior officers at the Desert Training Center. Over 40 colonels and generals crowd into the briefing room. Patton stands at the front. Behind him, a large map of Dieppe, marked with colored pins showing Canadian landing sites, German defensive positions, and the routes taken by the assault forces. He does not begin with pleasantries. Dieppe was a disaster, Patton says bluntly. The Canadian 2nd Infantry Division was destroyed. Early estimates suggest over 60% casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Of 5,000 men who landed, fewer than 2,000 made it back to England. The room is silent. Everyone has heard rumors, but this is the first official confirmation of the scale of the catastrophe. I'm going to tell you what happened at Dieppe, Patton continues, not because I want to criticize our allies. The Canadians are brave soldiers. They fought well. But because we need to learn from their mistakes so we don't repeat them. He turns to the map. First, timing. The raid was supposed to begin at 0450, just before dawn. This would give the assault force some darkness for approach, but enough light to see what they were doing on the beach. Good theory. But in practice, delays meant some units landed late, in full daylight, with no element of surprise. Lesson. In amphibious operations, timing is everything. If your schedule slips, you may need to abort rather than continue into certain disaster. Patton moves to the next point. Second, air and naval support. The RAF flew over the beaches. The Royal Navy shelled German positions. But it wasn't enough. The German bunkers survived. The machine gun nests survived. And when the Canadians hit the beach, they ran into intact defenses. Lesson: you cannot rely on air and naval bombardment to destroy fortifications. You need overwhelming fire support, or you need specialized equipment to deal with bunkers. He points to the section of the map showing the main Dieppe beach. Third, the beach itself. Dieppe has a shingle beach, large stones that are difficult to cross on foot and impossible for tanks. Intelligence said the tanks could handle it. Intelligence was wrong. The Churchill tanks got stuck. Most never moved more than a few yards from where they landed. Without armor support, the infantry was slaughtered. Lesson: understand your terrain. Actually understand it. Don't just read reports about it. If possible, get samples. Test your equipment on similar terrain. Know what you're getting into. Patton's voice rises slightly. Fourth, and this is critical, the Canadians did not fail because they lacked courage. They failed because the plan was flawed from the start. You cannot attack a fortified port head-on without overwhelming superiority in firepower. You especially cannot do it with the limited forces and limited time that the Canadians had. He lets this sink in. Now, here's what the Canadians did right, and you will pay attention to this because it may save your lives. Patton points to markers on the map showing Canadian penetration routes. Several small groups of Canadian infantry did break through into the town. They did it by moving fast, by not stopping on the beach, by accepting casualties and pushing forward through gaps in the defenses. Some of these men fought in Dieppe for hours before being killed or captured. They proved that aggressive action, even against heavy odds, can achieve penetration. But penetration is not breakthrough. You can get into an enemy position, but if you can't exploit it, if you can't widen the gap and bring up reinforcements, you'll be isolated and destroyed. That's what happened to the Canadians who reached Dieppe town. Patton pauses, looking at his assembled officers. So what do we take from this? What are the real lessons of Dieppe? He ticks them off on his fingers. 1. Amphibious assaults against fortified positions are extremely difficult and costly. Don't do them unless you absolutely have to. 2. If you must do them, use overwhelming force. Don't be clever. Don't be economical. Bring everything you have. 3. Speed matters. The Canadians who moved fastest off the beach had the best chance of survival. The ones who hesitated died. 4. Equipment matters. Make sure your tanks can handle the terrain. Make sure you have tools to breach obstacles. 5. Accept that you will take casualties, heavy casualties. If you can't accept that, don't launch the operation. One of the colonels raises his hand. Sir, does this mean we should avoid amphibious operations? Patton's eyes flash. Hell no. It means we need to do them better than the British and Canadians did at Dieppe. We're going to hit North Africa with amphibious landings. That's not optional. But we're going to do it right. We're going to learn from Canadian blood so we don't spill as much American blood. Another officer speaks up. Sir, what about the 30-minute breakthrough you mentioned earlier? Patton does not flinch. I was wrong. Some Canadian elements may have penetrated German lines quickly, but it wasn't a breakthrough. It was small groups of brave men getting into positions they couldn't hold. I mistook penetration for success. Don't make that mistake. Don't confuse movement with victory. He looks around the room. But here's what I will say about those 30 minutes. In the absolute chaos of Dieppe, under withering fire, some Canadians covered that beach in under 30 minutes and got into the town. They did that. And if they can do it, you can do it. Not by magic, not by luck, but by training, by aggression, by refusing to quit even when everything is going to hell. This is the core of what Patton takes from Dieppe. Not that aggressive tactics failed, but that they were incompletely executed. In his mind, the Canadian failure proves that half measures don't work. You cannot conduct a raid with limited forces and limited time against a fortified position and expect success, but you can conduct a full-scale assault with massive force and unlimited aggression and breakthrough. The difference is commitment. Patton spends the next hour going through tactical details with his officers: beach organization, movement techniques, fire and maneuver, how to keep moving under fire, how to identify and suppress enemy positions. Every lesson is drawn from the Dieppe reports, filtered through Patton's philosophy of aggressive action. Finally, he concludes the briefing. Gentlemen, the Canadians paid a terrible price at Dieppe, over 3,000 casualties in 9 hours. We owe it to them to learn from what they did. The brave men who died on that beach deserve to have their sacrifice mean something, and it will mean something if we use their lessons to win our battles. He pauses. One more thing. I want every man in this command to understand that the Canadians who fought at Dieppe were not defeated because they were cowards or because they were incompetent. They were defeated because they were given an impossible mission with inadequate resources. But they went anyway. They fought anyway. And some of them died trying to do the impossible, because that's what soldiers do. Patton's voice softens slightly, as much as Patton's voice ever softens. When we go into combat, when we hit those beaches in North Africa, remember Dieppe. Remember what happens when planning fails. Remember what happens when intelligence is wrong. Remember what happens when you don't have enough force for the mission, and then make goddamn sure we don't repeat those mistakes. He straightens. Dismissed. The officers file out, talking quietly among themselves. Patton remains in the briefing room with his chief of staff. The two men stand looking at the map of Dieppe. You think they'll learn, sir? The chief of staff asks. Patton shrugs. Some will, some won't. But we'll keep teaching until they do, because the alternative is American boys dying on beaches like the Canadians did. He traces the beach at Dieppe one more time. You know what the worst thing about Dieppe is? It didn't have to happen. The intelligence was bad. The plan was flawed. The Germans were too strong. But the British command approved it anyway. Sent those Canadian boys to die in a raid that had no chance of success. Patton's jaw clenches. That's not going to happen to American soldiers under my command. I'll accept casualties. I'll accept losses. But I will not send men to die in operations that can't possibly succeed. That's not courage. That's murder. Over the following months, as Patton prepares for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, the lessons of Dieppe shape his planning. He insists on overwhelming force at the landing sites. He demands extensive naval gunfire support, far more than the British used at Dieppe. He requires detailed terrain intelligence, including actual sand samples from North African beaches, to test whether American tanks can handle them. He drills his troops relentlessly on beach assault techniques, emphasizing speed and aggression, but also proper organization and fire support. When Operation Torch is launched in November 1942, American forces land at 3 points in French North Africa: Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. The landings are opposed by Vichy French forces, not Germans, and resistance is lighter than expected. But Patton's insistence on proper preparation, learned partly from the Dieppe disaster, helps ensure that American casualties are relatively light. After the North Africa landings, Patton continues to study Dieppe. He reads the official British report when it is finally compiled. He reads German after-action reports captured by Allied intelligence. He even reads accounts from Canadian survivors who eventually return to action and share their experiences. And Patton's opinion evolves. Initially, he saw Dieppe as a tactical failure, but a validation of his aggressive philosophy. Later, he comes to see it as a necessary disaster, a terrible but valuable lesson that saved lives in future operations. In 1943, preparing for the invasion of Sicily, Patton incorporates more Dieppe lessons. He insists that the American beaches in Sicily be selected for their tactical advantages, not their proximity to objectives. He demands that assault units be given achievable missions, not impossible tasks. And he emphasizes that commanders on the ground must have authority to adapt to changing conditions, not be locked into rigid plans. The Sicily landings, though not without problems, are far more successful than Dieppe. American forces get off the beaches quickly, establish beachheads, and begin pushing inland. Casualties, while significant, are far lower than they would have been without the lessons learned from the Canadian disaster. Patton himself later writes in his diary, in an entry dated July 1943, about Dieppe. The entry reveals his mature understanding of what happened there. Studied the Dieppe operation again. A brave but futile effort. The Canadians were sacrificed to test German defenses and to learn lessons. They learned them at the cost of thousands of casualties. We have benefited from their sacrifice. Every American soldier who survives a beach landing owes something to the Canadians who died at Dieppe. They showed us what not to do. That is a harsh but necessary lesson. Patton goes on to write about the 30-minute breakthrough that he initially believed had occurred. I was wrong about the speed of the Canadian penetration at Dieppe, but I was not wrong about the principle. Speed and aggression are essential in amphibious warfare. The Canadians who did penetrate German lines did so by moving fast. They died because they were unsupported, not because they moved quickly. The lesson is not to slow down, but to ensure that rapid advance is backed by adequate force. This is Patton at his most insightful. He can admit error while still maintaining his core beliefs. He can learn from failure while still advocating for aggressive action. By 1944, as the Allies prepare for D-Day, Patton is not directly involved in the Normandy planning. He is commanding a phantom army as part of the deception operation to convince the Germans that the invasion will come at Calais. But his influence is felt throughout the planning process because so many American commanders have trained under him and absorbed his lessons, including the lessons he extracted from Dieppe. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces land in Normandy, they do so with overwhelming force, extensive naval and air support, and detailed planning that reflects everything learned from Dieppe. The landings are successful. Casualties, while heavy at Omaha Beach, are far lighter than they were at Dieppe relative to the size of the force. The Allies establish a permanent foothold in France, and the invasion succeeds where the Dieppe raid failed. Patton, watching from England, knows that Canadian blood spilled at Dieppe 2 years earlier helped make D-Day possible. In July 1944, Patton finally gets his chance. He takes command of the Third Army and breaks out of Normandy in a massive armored thrust across France. His forces move with the speed and aggression he has preached for years. They cover hundreds of miles in weeks. They liberate towns and cities. They destroy German armies, and Patton's success validates his philosophy of warfare. But the lessons of Dieppe remain with him. When his staff proposes operations that seem too risky or based on inadequate intelligence, Patton sometimes invokes Dieppe. "Is this another Dieppe?" he asks. "Are we sending men to die in an operation that can't succeed?" It becomes his shorthand for a flawed plan. After the war, in his memoirs and in interviews, Patton speaks about Dieppe several times. He is always respectful of the Canadian soldiers who fought there. He never criticizes their courage or their performance, but he is harsh in his criticism of the planning and the decision-making that led to the raid. In one interview in 1945, Patton is asked what he learned from studying other nations' military operations. He mentions Dieppe specifically. "The Canadians at Dieppe taught us that courage alone is not enough. You need proper planning, adequate force, and realistic objectives. But they also taught us that determined soldiers can penetrate strong defenses if they move fast and don't quit. Both lessons are valuable." The interviewer asks about the 30-minute breakthrough. Patton smiles slightly. "That was a misunderstanding based on early reports. I thought the Canadians had broken through in 30 minutes. They didn't. But some of them got very far very fast, which proved that speed matters. I was wrong about what happened, but I wasn't wrong about the principle. This ability to separate tactical details from strategic principles is characteristic of Patton's military thinking. He can be wrong about facts while remaining right about concepts. The full story of what Patton told his staff about Dieppe is more complex than the simple version that sometimes appears in military histories. The popular version says that Patton praised the Canadian breakthrough and used it as an example of aggressive tactics. That version is partly true but incomplete. The reality is that Patton initially misunderstood what happened at Dieppe, then corrected his understanding, then extracted lessons that were both tactical and philosophical. What Patton actually told his staff evolved over time. On August 19th, based on fragmentary reports, he told them that the Canadians had broken through in 30 minutes and that this proved aggressive action works. On August 22nd, with more complete information, he told them that Dieppe was a disaster, but that specific lessons could be extracted about speed, firepower, and the importance of proper planning. Over the following months and years, he told them repeatedly that Dieppe represented both a warning and an inspiration. A warning against poorly planned operations. An inspiration because individual Canadian soldiers had shown what determination and aggression could accomplish even in the worst circumstances. But perhaps the most important thing Patton told his staff about Dieppe was something he said in a private conversation with his chief of staff in late August 1942. The conversation was recorded in the Chief of Staff's diary and provides insight into Patton's thinking. Patton said, "The Canadians proved something at Dieppe that people forget. They proved that soldiers will follow orders even when those orders are suicidal. They went onto those beaches knowing the odds were against them. They fought knowing they were probably going to die. That's the kind of courage that wins wars. But it's also the kind of courage that commanders can waste. We have a responsibility not to waste it. Every time we issue an order that sends men into combat, we need to make damn sure the mission is worth their lives." This is Patton, the philosopher of war, not just Patton, the aggressive tactician. He understood that the Canadian disaster at Dieppe was not just a military failure, but a moral failure of leadership. Someone had approved an operation that had little chance of success. Someone had sent 5,000 men to attack fortified positions with inadequate support, and that someone was responsible for the 3,000 casualties. Patton was determined not to be that someone. Throughout his combat commands, Patton was known for pushing his troops hard, for demanding maximum effort, for accepting high casualties in pursuit of victory. But he was also known for refusing missions he considered impossible, for arguing with superiors when he thought orders were flawed, for adapting plans when circumstances changed. This combination of aggression and pragmatism, of boldness and calculation, was shaped partly by his study of Dieppe. He learned that you could be aggressive without being stupid, that you could demand courage from your soldiers without wasting their lives, that speed and violence were essential but not sufficient. You also needed intelligence, planning, adequate resources, and realistic objectives. These lessons, extracted from the blood-soaked beaches of Dieppe, influenced how Patton commanded for the rest of the war. They influenced his decisions in North Africa, in Sicily, in France, and in Germany. They saved lives. American lives that might have been lost if Patton had stuck to his initial, simpler philosophy of pure aggression, without the nuance he gained from studying the Canadian disaster. In this sense, the Canadians who died at Dieppe made a contribution to Allied victory that went beyond the immediate tactical lessons about beach defenses and amphibious warfare. They taught one of America's most influential generals that there were limits to what aggression alone could accomplish. They taught him that soldiers, no matter how brave, need proper support and realistic missions. They taught him that commanders have a moral responsibility not to waste lives, and Patton, to his credit, learned those lessons and applied them. When Patton died in December 1945, shortly after the end of the war, his papers included extensive notes on various battles and operations. Among them was a file on Dieppe. In that file was a handwritten note, undated, that said simply, "Remember the Canadians. They paid the price for our education. Honor their sacrifice by not repeating their mistakes." This, ultimately, is what Patton told his staff about Dieppe, not in a single conversation or briefing, but in dozens of interactions over 3 years of war. He told them that the Canadians at Dieppe were brave soldiers who deserved respect, that their operation failed not because of their failings, but because of flawed planning. That specific tactical lessons could be extracted from the disaster, and that American forces had a moral obligation to learn from Canadian casualties so that those deaths would not be meaningless. It is a more complex and more honest legacy than the simple story of Patton praising a 30-minute breakthrough, but it is also more valuable. Because the real lesson of Dieppe, as understood by Patton and taught to his soldiers, was not about speed or aggression in isolation. It was about the complete package of military effectiveness, planning, intelligence, resources, leadership, and yes, aggressive execution. All of these elements working together. When they work together, as they did in many of Patton's operations, you get victory. When they don't, as at Dieppe, you get disaster. And the difference between victory and disaster, as Patton told his staff again and again, is not courage. Courage is constant. The difference is leadership. Leaders who ensure that courageous soldiers are given missions they can accomplish, support they can rely on, and objectives worth their sacrifice. That is what Patton learned from Dieppe. And that is what he told his staff, in words and actions, for the rest of the war. The Canadians at Dieppe failed to break through in 30 minutes, but they succeeded in teaching one of history's great commanders' lessons that would help win the war. And in the end, that may be the most important breakthrough of all.